Hello and welcome to this Fall of the Wall special on DW TV. I'm Heather Delisle.
And I'm John Berwick. We're covering the anniversary for you live from our studio here at the Brandenburg Gate, where most of the important events have now ended.
As you can see, a new day is dawning here in Berlin, but last night the square behind us was packed with people remembering that moment 20 years ago when on the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall came crashing down, an event that would change world history forever.
Ironically, of course, Heather, it happened because of a misunderstanding, an ambiguous statement at a press conference which the Western media interpreted as meaning that East Germany had opened its borders.
At an evening press conference in East Berlin, Politburo member Günter Schabowski made a sensational announcement.
Private journeys abroad can be applied for without preconditions, justifications or proof of family ties. The permits will be granted at short notice.
A journalist asked when. Schabowski's answer was a blunder of historic proportions.
It takes effect, as far as I know, immediately.
Western media waited for the first to cross. And it didn't take long.
We took the car and just drove off. Now we're here.
I'm keeping this to show my grandchildren.
The East German regime still believed it had things under control. But it was mistaken.
Nobody could have dreamed this would be possible.
They were off to a foreign land on the other side of town.
Who'd have thought? In the East, nothing lasts 50 years, not even the wall.
For those of us who were here in Berlin when the wall fell, it was such a profound and moving experience that for the moment we lost sight of everything else. But of course, life was going on in the rest of the world just as usual.
On November 9th, 1989, 85-year-old Deng Xiaoping resigns as head of China's armed forces. It is the former supreme leader's last official position within the ruling Communist Party. Anti-American demonstrations sweep through the Philippines. The protests coincide with President Corazon Aquino's state visit to Washington, D.C. Drama in the North Sea. 3 people are killed and another 15 injured in the collision of the ferry Hamburg and a container ship. At 7:30 p.m., the television network ZDF broadcasts its wildly popular quiz show, The Grand Prize, featuring host Wim Töke. 40% of West German TV viewers tune in. At the same time, East German television televises its own quiz show, Fun and Games with Hans-Georg Poneski. Wholesome family entertainment. The weather in Berlin on November 9th, 1989, light rain with intermittent sunshine and an average temperature of 6.6 degrees Celsius.
And joining us now in the studio is Neil Acheson, journalist, historian, expert on Eastern Europe and long-time correspondent here in Berlin. Thank you very much, Mr. Acheson, for coming in so early in the morning. Tell me, to start off with, how dangerous was the situation actually in Berlin around the time of November the 9th?
I think it was dangerous, more so than we now remember. It seems inevitable. It wasn't. The chaos of the press conference, which accidentally almost opened the wall, showed something else. What it showed was that nobody was really in control, and the situation at the border could have exploded. It might have gone the other way. Somebody might have opened fire. Somebody might have panicked. The crowds at the bridge might have suddenly lost patience and shoved and charged. Anything could have happened. So everybody is so lucky that it went the way it did. It might not have been peaceful.
The British weekly magazine The Economist, in its current issue, makes a statement that for me is quite an extraordinary statement, an assessment that the fall of the Berlin Wall, which of course then led to the whole process, or was part of the process of Eastern Europe being integrated into Western Europe, it describes it as the greatest leap forward in economic history. How do you view that assessment?
No, I think that's an extraordinary comment. This is about freedom. It's not about market economies, primarily. Yes, sure, market economies in an extraordinarily raw, untreated form were enforced on Eastern Europe and, of course, Central Europe, including Eastern Germany in a way, but with rather disastrous results. But basically, that's not what it was about. And you can't really say that full-blooded free market economies have been a success. Now, 20 years on, and after the crash of 2008, that particular market economy doesn't look so good. And what is more, the idea which was propagated at the time, which is that if you have, everybody is going to have liberal democracy and everybody is going to have a completely unregulated free market economy and they go indissolubly together, I mean, that's proved not to be the case.
But isn't it true that the demonstrators, for example, in Eastern Europe, certainly, of course, they wanted freedom of movement, they wanted democratic political freedoms, but they also, of course, wanted surely a certain standard of living. That it's true that in the last 20 years, I think it probably is true, don't you, that people have, a very large number, millions of people have moved from poverty, one could say, to something vaguely resembling the middle class.
That's absolutely true. I mean, what people wanted was they wanted, let's be normal. Let's be like other people. Over there, it works. Let's have some of that,
Yeah.
They said. But, there are more ways than one of getting that. And nobody offered them a social democratic kind of economy, a mixed economy, if you like, an advanced, rather old-fashioned form of the social market economy, which would have a lot of state regulation and slowly move towards freer markets, and that really would have been a better solution.
Mr. Acheson, you were also here, I believe, in 1961 when the wall was built. Is that right?
No, I was here a bit before that, in fact. I knew Berlin before the wall, and then I knew it after the wall, but I wasn't here when it went up.
How did you, nevertheless, as an historian and a journalist, how did you respond then to the wall going up? How did you see its significance?
Well, the strange thing is, and this sounds heartless, but I found it almost more understandable that there was a wall than that you could just walk from one world into another world across Berlin, which was a nice thing to be able to do, of course, better than not being able to move between the two parts of the city. But it certainly was very, very strange that you could just walk without even showing a passport, into one world of great red flags, darkness, and people looking suspiciously at you, and then back into the light.
Yes, it was nevertheless, though, a very brutal move, wasn't it? Because it went up overnight. People were separated. People who happened to be visiting friends in the western part of the city suddenly couldn't get back, and so on. There was very little resistance from the Allied powers. How do you explain that?
It certainly was absolutely brutal thing to do. It was a sort of coup d'etat, really, carried out, by the East German leadership against its own people. The reason the Allies didn't react more strongly was that, in a way, and again, it's an awful thing to say, but they were quite relieved to have the situation finally defined, because what they were afraid of always was that the situation in East Berlin and East Germany would get out of control. People would start storming across, there would be a revolution, an uprising, the flow through the frontiers would become uncontrollable, there would be fighting, the West Germans would find it unable to hold themselves back, and then there would be a general conflict which nobody could control, which might escalate into the ultimate
A chilling thought. Thank you very much, Neil Ashton, for coming in so early in the morning and giving us these insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll be back live from the Brandenburg Gate in just a few minutes. But first, let's cross over to our downtown studios for a news update. And there's Brian Thomas. Take it away.
Thanks, Heather. Well, Lebanon's Prime Minister Saad Hariri has formed a 30-member national unity government after months of deadlock. Hariri got formal approval for his cabinet from the Lebanese President, Michel Suleiman. It comes 5 months after a parliamentary election in which Hariri's bloc won a narrow majority, but had to negotiate a deal with the opposition to form a government. 15 cabinet posts will be filled by Hariri's Western-backed coalition. 10 ministers will come from the opposition, which includes the Hezbollah organization. President Barack Obama has hosted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for closed-door talks in Washington amid friction between the two allies over efforts to revive stalled Mideast peace talks. Netanyahu called for an immediate resumption of negotiations, rejecting Palestinian calls for a halt to the building of Jewish settlements in the West Bank first. The two leaders also discussed Iran's nuclear program at the White House meeting. Naval ships from North and South Korea have exchanged fire in the Yellow Sea. That's according to the South Korean news agency Yonhap. It says the South Korean Navy vessel clashed with a patrol boat from the north that crossed the demarcation line between the two countries. No injuries have been reported by the South, but military officials there say the northern boat was seriously damaged in the skirmish. North and South Korea have fought 2 deadly sea battles in the last decade near the contested sea border called the Northern Limit Line. Well, here in Germany, along with the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 9th also marks a far different chapter in German history. 71 years ago, on November 9th, 1938, state-sanctioned anti-Jewish riots swept the country. This night became known as the Night of Broken Glass, as thousands of Jewish-owned businesses and hundreds of synagogues were destroyed.
While many Berliners joyfully commemorated the fall of the wall, this more somber ceremony recalled an earlier November 9th in German history. Several thousand young people took part in a candlelit procession in memory of the Kristallnacht pogrom.
20 years ago, the gates to freedom were opened. 71 years ago, we saw the doors of Auschwitz beginning to open, which is why it's essential that this country acknowledges its past, even on such a joyous day.
On November 9th, 1938, Nazis killed hundreds of Jews and ransacked synagogues, homes, and businesses. About 30,000 Jewish men were arrested. Many were sent to concentration camps. November 9th is an emotionally complicated day. But as the German Chancellor said, both anniversaries show that freedom is not self-evident, but must be fought for and defended.
And staying in Germany, the country's new center-right coalition government has passed fiscal measures it says will help further stimulate the economy. Cabinet ministers have signed off on a package worth some 8.5 billion euros. More than half will be spent on increasing benefits to families with children. The rest will fund cuts in business and inheritance taxes. However, the coalition partners are still reportedly at odds over far-reaching reforms to the overall taxation system. Look at some business news now. Asian stock prices are rallying this Tuesday in step with Wall Street. Investors are also encouraged by G20 pledges over the weekend to keep the financial aid flowing until the economic recovery firmly takes hold in Tokyo. The Nikkei average closed up 0.6%. Hang Seng Index is just under 1% positive territory. And the euro now trading at $1.4973. Some 100 creditors of the now defunct Arcandor have gathered in the Ruhr Valley to learn the latest on the retail and tourism group's liquidation. In its best year, 2005, Arcandor had revenues of 15.5 billion euros, but critics say the company failed to react to changes in the retail and tourism industries. Many creditors have given up hope of ever getting their investment back. Winding up Arcandor's diverse holdings could take up to 10 years.
The venue in Essen seats up to 8,000 people. But less than 100 chairs were filled during Monday's meeting. Most of Arcandor's creditors didn't even bother to make the journey. They've resigned themselves to the likelihood that they'll only ever see a tiny fraction of the money Arcandor owes them.
Arcandor's creditors have lodged claims of 15 billion euros. All Arcandor has are the assets left over at the end of insolvency procedures, and these assets have to be divided up between claimants.
Arcandor's assets now amount to less than 100 million euros. So for every euro that creditors lent the retailer, they can only expect to get 10 cents in return. Until recently, Arcandor's annual sales came to several billion euros. In early June, it announced it could no longer pay the rent for its stores. 3 days later, it filed for bankruptcy. On Tuesday, creditors will be discussing the future of Arcandor's subsidiary Karstadt, Germany's biggest department store chain.
The European Commission has objected to the planned acquisition of Sun Microsystems by Oracle. The Commission says the proposed €5 billion deal could harm competition in the database market. Sun says it will fight the objections. U.S. authorities have already given the green light to the merger, which both companies had hoped to wrap up in August. The Frankfurt Stock Exchange operator, Deutsche Börse, is the sole bidder for a major stake in the Warsaw Stock Exchange, now that others have pulled out and a final deadline has passed. The Warsaw Exchange has closed with the beginning of World War II in 1939 and was only reopened in 1991 after the Soviet bloc's collapse. The size of Deutsche Börse's bid has not been disclosed.
Champagne glasses were filled in late October as paper manufacturer Arctic Paper was floated on the Warsaw Stock Exchange. It was the 8th IPO in Warsaw so far this year. Arctic Paper does a lot of business in the region, like many of the 376 companies traded on the Warsaw Exchange. Their total market capitalization amounts to about 150 billion euros. Now the exchange itself is to be partly privatized. Between 51 and over 73% is up for sale. The state is holding on to the remainder. Warsaw is the biggest stock exchange in Central and Eastern Europe. Deutsche Börse wants a stake to help extend its reach eastwards, as far as the Baltic states and even Ukraine.
China says it will double investments in Africa in an attempt to keep the momentum of trade with the continent up. The country is now ahead of the U.S. in total trade with Africa. It also needs raw materials for its ongoing industrial expansion.
China is providing 10 billion euros in loans to Africa, lower export duties to the continent, and it's forgiving the debts of some of the poorest nations there. Investing in Africa has become a standard feature of Beijing's foreign policy.
Because of the financial crisis, international investment has been on the decline. But in the first 3 quarters of this year, China increased its investments by more than 77% in Africa.
The aid is earmarked for infrastructure investment and social projects. Africa is one of China's most important sources of raw materials, as well as a growing market for Chinese products. Trade volumes between the two have increased by a factor of 10 since 2001. Last year, trade was worth more than 67 billion euros. But China's involvement in Africa has also drawn criticism abroad. Beijing is accused of ignoring human rights violations in states that it does business with, including pursuing arms deals with war-torn Sudan.
Tropical storm Ida is nearing the U.S. Gulf Coast after disrupting oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico and triggering flood alerts from Louisiana to Florida. The storm, which has been downgraded now from a Category 2 hurricane, is still packing winds of up to 100 kilometers per hour. Residents in coastal areas have been advised to evacuate their homes. In El Salvador, The death toll from Hurricane Ida has risen to 125. Many of the victims were killed in mudslides. Thousands of people have lost their homes. Over 70 people are still missing. And now it's back to Heather and John in our special live coverage of the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Welcome back to our special programming on the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall.
Yes, Deutsche Welle has been bringing you 24-hour coverage of the events of this anniversary, and a new day is now dawning here in Berlin. Heather, there's been a lot going on. There's a lot's been going on in Berlin here to celebrate this anniversary, hasn't there, Heather?
Well, there certainly has, John, and in case you at home didn't have a chance to get in on the action yourself, we've thrown together some of the highlights for you.
In one of Monday's highlights, Lech Wałęsa, the former Polish Labour leader and later president, knocked over the first of 1,000 giant dominoes representing segments of the wall. The gesture recalled the uprising by the Polish Solidarity movement, which set in motion the revolutionary events of 1989. Earlier, there was a celebration concert. Tenor Placido Domingo gave a rousing rendition of one Berlin classic, Das ist die Berliner Luft, that's the air in Berlin. It was something to warm the hearts of everyone, including some of the world's most powerful leaders, on a cold, rainy evening. Then Chancellor Merkel, Berlin Mayor Klaus Wowereit and honoured guests from the US, Russia, Britain and France took a symbolic walk from the east to the west through the Brandenburg Gate. Liberty was the main theme of Chancellor Merkel's address.
Ohne Freiheit, keine Demokratie.
Without freedom, there is no democracy, no diversity, no tolerance, and ultimately no such thing as a unified Europe.
The representatives of the former Allies paid tribute to the people of Berlin.
We must pledge ourselves to work together to advance freedom beyond its current frontiers, so that people everywhere are afforded the opportunities to pursue their dreams and live up to their God-given potential.
Liebe Freunde,
dear friends, the 9th of November, 1989, was a day when you people of Berlin changed the world by making your dream of freedom come true.
So as we stand here, as free people, gathered today in the shadow of history, let us pledge that we will work together to write the next chapter of the human story. Let us write a chapter of liberty and of prosperity and of peace. Vielen Dank.
Liebe Berliner.
My dear Berliners, I wish you health and prosperity and all the best.
Alles Gute.
The celebrations began with an ecumenical service in eastern Berlin attended by the German President Horst Köhler. 20 years ago, the Gethsemane Church was a gathering point for members of the East German opposition.
The
Gethsemane Church did not just witness scenes of joy. Here, as in the biblical Garden of Gethsemane, there were also hours of despair. Here, moral courage and the spirit of freedom came up against the rough reaction of the East German authorities.
In the afternoon, Chancellor Merkel crossed over the Bornholm Bridge, the first crossing to open between East and West. She herself passed this way with crowds of East Berliners that night. 20 years later, she was accompanied by the former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, whom she thanked for his role in the events.
You made it possible. You allowed history to take its course, and that was much more than we could have expected. Thank you for that, and thank you for being here with us today.
Aside from the official celebrations, many people marked the occasion in their own way. Thousands responded to calls on the internet to meet up along a stretch where the wall stood for 28 years. At 8:15 in the evening, they joined hands. Then at 8:27, the exact time the wall fell 20 years ago, they let go again. British artist Martin Butler had the idea to form a human wall.
My proposition is to ask people to think about walls, to think about borders, to think about tolerance, to think about openness.
The organisers estimated that 6,000 enthusiastic volunteers took part.
We thought it was a great idea, a lovely commemoration.
The official celebrations ended with a giant fireworks display, but the party is set to continue through the night.
Our reporter Alan Hoagland is standing by at Checkpoint Charlie, which was the Allied crossing point in downtown Berlin. Alan, the 10th of November was, of course, the first day after the fall of the wall 20 years ago. What's Checkpoint Charlie like now? How has it changed?
Well, John, today Checkpoint Charlie seems like a normal street corner. People are on their way to work, sweeping the street, they're jogging, going about their business. The party is over, whereas 20 years ago it would have still been raging on at this hour. People reunited with lost relatives and loved ones and enjoying their newfound freedom. But I think most important is that the checkpoint now is something that's here as a reminder of what was. The wall is no more. Germany is united. Everything the wall stood for, the Cold War, the division of a country, all that has now been relegated to history and is no longer anything that is present in people's lives.
Alan, our coverage of the events is coming to a close. Would you like to sum up for us what has been the atmosphere of this 20th anniversary?
Well, it's been a wonderful atmosphere, and I think it was a very important event to mark. You know, 20 years ago, people experienced the celebration of a lifetime, if you will. Their lives changed forever. For a time, it seemed that all their other problems were forgotten. They were only concentrating on the jubilation that they were experiencing at that moment. And then, of course, life went back to normal, and their everyday problems, as they are for all of us, were once again present. But I think this celebration was a reminder to them that whatever is going on in their life, the wall is gone, Germany is united, and because of that, whatever they're going through, it's somehow better than it would have been if the wall hadn't fallen 20 years ago.
Well, Alan, as you said, life is returning to normal, or has returned to normal. You've been working hard, you've been up all night. Go and have some breakfast.
Thank you, John.
Well, Berlin has always been considered a mecca of pop music. The divided city proved a huge draw for both major artists and those who had yet to become chart toppers. Our next report looks at some of the hits spawned right here in the German capital.
In West Berlin, the wall became a canvas for countless music videos in the 1980s, thanks to its powerful symbolism. The Kreuzberg district bordering the wall during the Cold War evolved into a centre of anti-establishment culture. Singer Rio Reiser, frontman of Kreuzberg-based Tornsteiner Scherben, used the wall there as a backdrop for the video accompanying a satirical hit imagining him as the King of Germany. The divided city also had its appeal for stars from further afield. Berlin's melancholic image was perfect for the sound of Depeche Mode. The British electronic band came to West Berlin to record material, but also to use the city as a backdrop for their Everything Counts video. Demise, the wall became a frequent music video motif symbolising change and freedom. A West Berlin youth choir was sampled together with famous soundbites in a track dedicated to Berlin and there being no walls in its heart. German rockers, the Scorpions, celebrated the peaceful revolution in Wind of Change, a song that topped the charts across Europe. A year later, Irish rock giants U2 released the global hit single One. The song was produced in Berlin, as was the memorable video, featuring the East German Trabant, cars that had become an iconic part of reunification.
And we're joined now in the studio by journalist Connie Rudat. Connie, back before the wall came down, you worked as an interpreter and a tour manager in East Berlin and East Germany. What was that like?
Well, it was a very interesting time, I have to say. It all started in March 1987, or in 87 in general, when Berlin celebrated its 750th anniversary. By the way, both parts, East and West. And my agency was asked, do you have an interpreter who could help translate for rock bands or work as a tour manager? And I was hired, and I was just lucky, very lucky. And it was a great time for me. It was my sort of window to the West, you know, to tour with those bands and work with them. That was amazing.
Well, rock stars are notorious for their outrageous demands in some case. How hard was it to fulfill these requests and these demands that they had in a country that essentially couldn't fulfill them?
Well, one point was, of course, they had their own catering crew here. It was amazing what stuff they brought with themselves. They didn't have to buy this in East Germany. And since most of the concerts took place in East Berlin, they simply went west and bought it in the West. And I have to say, I was sometimes even asked, Connie, where can we buy drugs? And I said, I don't know, not in the East.
East Berlin?
Where? No way, you know. For the basics, I mean, you could buy basic stuff, food in the supermarkets. That wasn't a big problem, so I could point them to those places. But otherwise, they simply went west and got it from there.
By spending so much time with these people, did it make you want to escape to the West? Did that thought cross your mind?
No, it didn't cross my mind, because I thought somehow that was a very special opportunity for me to work with them here. Of course, it was always a bit sad when they crossed the border to give concerts in West Berlin. I had to stay here. I couldn't, you know, accompany them and go with them and work there. But I was, in those days, quite happy with the job which I was doing here, and no, it didn't cross my mind to leave to the West.
Now, everything changed when the wall came down. What changed for you?
Well, the main thing that changed for me, I moved from East Berlin to West Berlin. I found my husband, who is West German, and so that was very new for me. And of course, the traveling thing. I was always longing for traveling. Working as an interpreter, especially for English, I never had a chance before the wall came down to travel to an English-speaking country. And not only that I can now travel, but I even worked in England, I worked in New York, and all these opportunities were just fantastic. And I'm so glad I was young enough to enjoy all this and to get these chances and opportunities.
Yeah. Well, even getting the training as an English interpreter must have been something quite extraordinary. We've heard stories from people tonight who said, you know, their mother was an English teacher. She wasn't allowed to actually practice her profession.
Indeed, indeed, you say it. I was often asked by English native speakers, where did you learn your English? And I said, well, we basically learned it in a laboratory from tapes. We had a few native speakers at university, teachers who taught us, but otherwise it was from tapes, tapes, tapes. Listening to tapes, repeating. Well, later, of course, when I really worked with English-speaking people from all different countries, Africans, Indians, you know, I had to cope with so many different dialects and accents, but most of it I picked up from the people I worked with.
And where were you and what were you doing? I have to ask this
You mean
question.
that special night?
I have to ask this question, that special night.
In fact, I was translating, a simultaneous translator at a conference called Looking East, where Western managers were invited from the music business to discuss with Eastern managers, authorities, how can we explore the Eastern German and Eastern European market in the music business. I mean, the main problem was that the Eastern Bloc and East Germany in particular didn't have the hard currency to pay for all this. And this conference ended that particular night with a fantastic cultural program, a crossover concert of classical and rock music. And some friends, roadies I knew from previous interpreting assignments, asked me, Connie, did you hear that? The wall came down. Schabowski said, we can all go west now. I said, no, I don't believe it, I don't believe it. And since I was a single mother, my little son was at home alone, and I was tired from constant interpreting for 2 days in the booth. So I thought, no, I better go home and watch television. And then I saw those pictures on television, and I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I was in tears, tears of joy and happiness, of course. And so I watched it mainly from home, but I think all night.
Yeah, it is a night to remember. Connie Rodat, thank you so much for joining us here this morning.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Well, it seems like everyone, as we just heard, has a story to tell about where they were and what they were doing when that news first came through. We sent our reporters out to speak to a few people about how they experienced the fall of the Berlin Wall.
I was on an African island, and our taxi driver, who couldn't speak proper English or French, said something that sounded like the word wall. And I said, yes, we have a wall. And then he tried again, and we couldn't believe our ears. Right away, we went to the next bar and called home. Of course, it was quite an experience there, too.
I was in Bonn at home. I was working and basically was completely unaware of what was happening. Then a friend from Seattle called me, an American friend, and he said, congratulations. Now all our dreams have come true.
I was listening to the news late at night, and I suddenly saw people streaming toward the wall at the Bornholmer Straße crossing, and they were hugging each other, and I couldn't believe it at all. I would have never gone there myself, because I thought there was no way it would end peacefully. And I didn't want to leave the children alone because of the danger that something could happen to us.
In that particular night, we played a club in West Berlin together with a few colleagues who later founded Rammstein. We were Easterners, but we had a work permit for being in West Berlin, and 1 or 2 hours before midnight, Easterners came in and waved their ID cards and cheered that the wall was open and everybody's dancing at the Brandenburg Gate, and we couldn't believe it. And then we went to a border crossing nearby and saw a huge party and actually got very drunk, and the rest I cannot remember.
Well, once the wall fell, many East Germans knew they would never return home. But once in the West, many of them found themselves without a home, a job, or any means to support themselves. The West German government helped where it could, but for many, the dream of freedom had come true. But building up a new life proved more difficult than they had imagined.
These suitcases were all they took with them to start their new lives. In September 1989, these East German refugees arrived in West Germany via Hungary through a hole in the Iron Curtain.
The first impression was really overwhelming. No one should be kept from seeing this.
And from seeing it legally. People shouldn't be chased down by our East German state. They should treat us like human beings and let us travel. And if you're not locked in, you don't need to flee.
At first, the migrants stayed in transit camps like this one in Gießen. A fresh start and a chance to work and a place to live. Help wanted ads were already popping up around the camps. The human tide from east to west continued unabated. Weeks later, thousands of East Germans arrived through the West German embassy in Prague, a catastrophe for the communist regime. The East German state worked feverishly to craft new travel laws. Then came the historic events of the 9th of November. Suddenly, the borders were open, and East Germans were finally free to travel back and forth. But more and more opted to leave the country for good. They were frustrated and unsure of what would happen next in East Germany. And they were willing to take a chance on a better life in the West.
It took a while to decide. I'm married. I left my 2 children and my wife behind. They have a flat in Görlitz, but my wife still can't make up her mind. I think you have to look beyond that. I don't expect that things will change overnight.
In 1989, more than 340,000 East Germans relocated to the West, most of them in November. Setting up additional camps was the only way authorities could control the westward flood of people. For many, cooped up in cold, provisional quarters, all that remained of the life they'd left behind was their old Trabi car.
And standing by at the Bridge of Spies, the Glienicke Bridge, is our reporter Simon Young. Simon, how are you holding up there? Good morning.
Good morning, Heather. Yes, the Bridge of Spies, Glienicke Brücke. It's cold, and that's appropriate to this quintessential Cold War setting. This bridge, which in Cold War days didn't just span the River Havel as it still does, it was a place where East and West met, except that it was in general impassable for almost everybody except a very few diplomatic and military personnel from the Western Allies, and they used this bridge when they wanted to cross. They had missions, military missions in East Germany where the Soviet forces were stationed, and one member of the British military mission to the Soviet troops in East Germany is here with me this morning still. Robin Greenham, thanks very much for being here with us today. First of all, what I'd like to ask you is about 1989. What do you remember of the 10th of November when this bridge was finally opened after having been closed for so many years?
Well, it was a huge surprise. I was in West Berlin at 5:45 on the 10th in the evening, and we got a call from the Mission House warrant officer here in our house in Potsdam, and he said that Soviets had told us that they're opening the bridge at 6 o'clock. In other words, 1800. So I slammed all my office drawers to and jumped in the car and got down here by about 6:15. By which time all hell was let loose. Similar stories to what we'd seen in West Berlin the day before.
And what were those scenes? Was it scenes of joy, or were people still amazed that they were able to cross the bridge?
I think it was both. It was incredible. There were Westies, if I may use that expression, West Germans here, with champagne and Sekt greeting the Potsdamers and others who had come across the bridge. There was a long queue of cars as far as we could see, not very much movement because there were so many people around you could hardly move, and everybody was absolutely beside themselves. They were kissing, there was kissing and hugging and all the rest of it. Strange people kissing and hugging one another. It was fantastic.
Right. Now, this bridge was known as the Bridge of Spies because the Cold War superpowers exchanged spies 3 times across this bridge. But there were other reasons as well. You yourself were involved in reconnaissance missions in East Germany, checking up on the Soviet military. You were telling me just now that in one occasion you found a bullet shot into the back of your vehicle. Tell us about that kind of story.
Well, there were always times, I mean, the mission's job, whether it was the British, American or French mission, was to keep an eye on what was happening on the other side of the wall. And in so doing, be able to reinsure our own force commander-in-chief that actually, say, a troop movement, a large troop movement, which he hadn't seen before, wasn't in fact getting ready for an attack on West Berlin or anywhere else on the West Germany, but in fact was a perfectly routine maneuver that the Soviets did every autumn or something like that. And in carrying out that task, obviously we had moments where our job was easy, where we had, say, a good bit of distance between the two of us and them, and we could see or photograph whatever it was was. And there were times that we actually had to get quite close to do that. When we got close, sometimes that itself became a bit dangerous.
Right, so you were very well aware that the Soviets were stationed here not very far away. When this bridge was opened, were you quite sure, was the British military quite sure that Mikhail Gorbachev wasn't going to send in the tanks and intervene in support of the East German regime after all?
Well, I personally believe that for some years that had been a myth. That was the case in the real bad days of the Cold War, I think, and justifiable reaction to it. But in this case, I think we were just unsure what the reaction of the Soviet forces in East Germany was going to be to this extraordinary event. And obviously there's an element of danger there. You know, a quick reaction to something might be the wrong reaction. And so we did our best to keep the chain of communication open and to keep them informed as to what was going on, and as it were, try and tackle this problem together.
Well, thank you very much, Robin. Fortunately, as we all know, the 9th of November and the 10th of November here at the Glienicke Bridge was a peaceful revolution in East Germany. Later today, the preparations are going on now. There will be celebrations here with music, dancing and bands from Russia and America performing here to mark this too, a small part of the story of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Back to you in the studio.
All right, Simon Young there for us, live from the Glienicke Brücke. Thank you very much, Simon.
500 Meter, mehr ist das nicht. 500 Meter eine Freiheit, ich weiß es nicht.
Zum ersten Mal?
Natürlich, das ist das erste Mal. Wir konnten noch nie. Wir wollten immer, haben versucht und es ging nicht. Auf einmal, wir ist hin.
Wie findet ihr den Empfang hier, wie die Leute euch aufnehmen?
Bombastisch, also besser geht's ja, also keine Worte.
The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the end of the Cold War and changed the face of Europe. Since then, 10 more countries have joined the EU, and you can now travel from the Baltic to the Mediterranean without even showing your passport. How is the event seen by our European neighbours? The Italians, for instance.
Azzurro, il pomeriggio è troppo azzurro, è lungo per me, mi accorgo di non avere.
It was a wonderful day for all Germans. All those families who had been separated for decades.
The fall of the wall stands for the rebirth of Europe, an impulse for cultural and economic growth.
I remember the feeling of relief. I was so pleased for the Berliners that now no one else would be shot dead amid barbed wire.
I'm from the Erasmus generation and studied abroad. I had a totally different experience of Europe from my parents. So the fall of the wall was a huge influence on this vision of a unified Europe.
People from all over the world have been writing into us with their personal memories of what they were doing on the night of the 9th of November back in 1989. Here are some of the emails you've sent us.
Bitte, Sie können
Heather, I know you have a 7-year-old son. Have you ever tried to explain to him what Berlin was like before the wall came down?
You know, John, it's a really difficult situation, and I live basically a couple of hundred meters into East Berlin, right on the Bernauer Straße, as we saw, you know, which was part of the strip there. And there's a bit of wall that goes through Berlin where they've taken cobblestones and set them out in a big long line. And so I go with Ryan, my son Ryan, whenever we go through there, we make a point of hopping across the wall, just to symbolize, you know, what happened 20 years ago and what that meant. But it is difficult to explain to someone who's never lived in that kind of world what it's like to have an entire country and entire people trapped and not allowed to go on vacation to Mallorca or, you know, take off to the beach somewhere. It's kind of a difficult thing. But at the end of the day, I'm really glad he doesn't have to grow up in that kind of world. Oh, no. I mean, that's as simple as it is. And our next report does take a look at some of the children of today and how they see what happened back then.
It was a wall through Berlin, right through.
It was because of East Germany. They didn't want any more people to leave.
I know it divided Germany and Europe.
Families were split up.
It fell on November 9th.
Then everyone came through it and they knocked it down.
There was a big party. Everyone was overjoyed.
It was broken into pieces and spread across the world.
We've got a little piece of the wall at home.
And you've been watching DW TV's 24-hour live broadcast from Potsdamer Platz and the Brandenburg Gate in German, in English, and in Espanol.
It's been a great privilege for us to host this special program on the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, das will ich auch.
DWTV aus der Mitte Europas.